The Palestinian embassy in Egypt is seeking temporary residency permits for tens of thousands of people who've arrived from Gaza during the war. Diab al-Lu, the Palestinian ambassador in Cairo, says as many as 100,000 Gazans had crossed into Egypt where they lack official papers. Egypt's State Information Service has not commented.
Residency permits have to do with enrolling children in schools, opening bank accounts, receiving money transfers, transferring money, and obtaining visas to travel outside Egypt and return from abroad. This issue is vital and very important. It is a fundamental demand for all Palestinian people. We have met with many delegations from those who left Gaza or arrived in Cairo from Gaza, representing various categories. We almost daily receive delegations from them. Their main demand is residency permits.
The President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, has announced that the EU will provide Lebanon with a financial package worth €1 billion. The Lebanese president had called for help in dealing with the large number of refugees from Syria who fled to the country. Von der Leyen said much of the money would go towards dealing with migration as well as towards security and border management. Lebanon's economy has been in free fall since 2019.
First and foremost, to say that the European Union strongly supports Lebanon and its people, and we want to reinforce our long-standing cooperation. This was also the very clear message of European leaders at our last summit. And today we, Nikos and me, are here in a team spirit of Europe to reiterate that message. Today we discussed how we can strengthen our political and economic relations and support the security and stability of Lebanon. We are committed to maintain legal pathways open to Europe and resettle refugees from Lebanon to the European Union. At the same time, we count on your good cooperation to prevent illegal migration and to combat migrant smuggling. Finally, we understand the challenges that Lebanon faces with hosting Syrian refugees and other displaced persons. It is vital to ensure the well-being of the host communities and Syrian refugees. Since 2011, the European Union has supported Lebanon with €2.6 billion, not only for the Syrian refugees, but also for the host communities, and we will continue to do so. We will also look at how we can make the EU's assistance more effective. This includes exploring how to work on a more structured approach to voluntary returns to Syria in close cooperation with UNHCR. And at the same time, there needs to be strengthened support from the international community for humanitarian and early recovery programs in Syria.
The President of the European Commission there, Ursula von der Leyen. Well, for more on most of those stories, I'm joined now in the studio by Arise international correspondent Faith Orr. Good to see you, Faith. In the last couple of hours or so, President Biden delivering his first extensive remarks about the campus protests in the US. Tell us more. What do you make of it?
It was unexpected remarks as well. The press were only notified about 30 minutes before Biden started to speak. So he clearly felt like he needed to say something after all of these protesters were cleared out by police. He said the US isn't an authoritarian nation. They don't squash dissent, but neither is it a lawless country. And there's a civil society there and order must prevail. He said it's a matter of what's right. There is the right to protest, but there's not the right to cause chaos. And he went on in that vein for some time. I think the most interesting bits from his speech were that he said you can't have threats of violence against Jewish students, you also can't have threats of violence against Arab Americans or people who support the Palestinian cause. He said there's no space in America for racism. Now, when he'd finished his speech, as he was leaving the room, a reporter shouted and asked him whether this the protests had changed his mind, had caused him to have a rethink at all in any of the policies for the Middle East, and he simply said no as he walked away. And then another reporter asked him whether he thought the National Guard should be deployed to clear the rest of the protesters, and he also said no to that. So he says he'll always defend free speech, but he's also going to stand up for the rule of law.
Very interesting, and I understand that immediate responses from some of the protesting students have come through. They've rejected the comments made by the president. What's the latest that you're hearing about those pro-Palestinian protests across the country? I'm wondering if the police have actually been successful in dismantling all of them now.
Not all of them, no. We have seen them make quite inroads into the dismantling process, but for instance, there's still protesters on site in New York and in California, which would have been the two biggest hit by the overnight clearances. We know over the past 2 weeks there's been about 1,600 arrested in total. Last night, kind of early hours of this morning, 132 students were arrested from the university in LA. They were put on buses and they were taken away. Officers fired flashbangs, removed barricades as they were clearing it. We know there's also been a crackdown at Dartmouth in New Hampshire. 90 were arrested there. Another 2 universities in upstate New York where 45 people were arrested. Now, the supporters of these camps say that it is causing division because it's highlighting these, what they describe as stark inconsistencies. So you have a government which says it backs human rights, unwaveringly supporting Israel, which the people in these camps say is carrying out a genocide. You then have universities who say they stand for free thinking and free speech, using the police to clear protests. And then you have some politicians who have in the past railed against things like safe spaces as these liberal ideas, now saying, well, Jewish students don't feel safe or pro-Israeli students don't feel safe. So there is this, it's just highlighting these divisions in the US. And one man, of course, who often wades in when division is mentioned is former President Donald Trump. He has also spoken about it today. He has praised police in New York and California for cracking down on the protesters. And he said, and these are his words, "These are radical left lunatics and they've got to be stopped."
That's interesting. Moving away from the United States, we've just heard that Hamas are saying they'll send a delegation back to Egypt soon for further Gaza ceasefire talks. Their statement said that the Hamas leadership was studying the latest peace proposals in what was described as a positive spirit. What do you make of that?
Yes, so the chief of Hamas, the political chief of Hamas, Ismail Haniyeh, he has said that. He said the group has a positive spirit in studying the ceasefire proposal. We were expecting to actually hear a little bit more from them by now. The fact that they're going back to Cairo before they make any announcement on whether they've accepted any of these proposals would indicate that there are more talks to be done. It sounds like they're going back to speak to the mediators a bit more, so perhaps not fully accepting everything that is in those proposals. I mean, we know there are sticking points. We know that Hamas wants full Israeli withdrawal, an end to the war. We know that Netanyahu is not willing to grant that. So there are these sticking points. It'll be interesting to see what else the mediators in Cairo can come up with.
Right, and if there is a middle course between those rather stiff positions. We heard also that a BBC team had been investigating the conduct of the Israeli military in the West Bank. There was a case of a boy who died in the West Bank. They're saying it's a potential war crime, according to the UN. Beyond the case of this boy, they've also found evidence of a number of potential breaches of international law, and Israeli military operations in the West Bank have increased since I think you mentioned that a couple of days ago, since Hamas's attack on Israel last October. We hear the violence there is surging. Just tie that all together for us.
The violence absolutely is surging, but we need to remember that the violence in the West Bank hasn't just kicked off since October. This is something that has been an ongoing issue. I mean, one of the more high-profile cases was when Shireen Abu Akleh, the journalist, of course, was shot by an Israeli sniper. Now, very often in these incidents, and the same as you mentioned there with that boy, that was an 8-year-old boy. He was shot alongside a 15-year-old boy. They were both shot dead. the Israeli military say they only open fire when there's a direct threat. They are investigating that case, but they often say that. They always say, oh, we're investigating. And even in the case of Shireen, when they did admit that one of their snipers was at fault, no one was actually held accountable for what happens. And that is often the problem. The US has actually investigated one of the battalions that serves in the West Bank, one of the Israeli battalions. And just in the past few days, they found that that battalion had committed crimes, committed abuses. That battalion has not been sanctioned. The US is now breaking its own laws by finding against it that abuses have been committed and then not doing anything. And that is another issue that's being raised in America, that they are willing to let Israel get away with things other countries perhaps wouldn't, would have sanctions against them. So there are these army units. They carry out daily raids, very often destroying infrastructure. The idea is to try and force people out so that the settlements can expand. We see lots and lots of attacks by Israeli settlers there as well. Those have certainly been on the rise since October. Again, it's trying to get the land. That is the main objective of the settlers there in the West Bank.
It's got so many strands, this Gaza story, doesn't it? Thank you, Faith. Faith Orr is Arise international correspondent.